Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop and the track focused on networking, collaboration, and scientific innovation in conferences and meetings. This is our anchor leg of what has been a wonderful conference over really 3 days, last Thursday and Friday and today. My name is Gene Shin. I am Deputy Director of the Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, or COSWOD office at the National Institutes of Health. I'm also a proud member of the Future of Scientific Conferencing Workshop Planning Committee. I will be moderating this session focused on catalysts of innovation, exploring the impact of scientific convenings on knowledge sharing and idea diffusion. In this session, we will hear a brief presentation from each speaker. There are 4 in total. After all of the presentations, we will engage in a group moderated discussion, including questions that are submitted by the audience. At any time in the session, you may use the Q&A function on the screen to submit your questions for the speakers. You may also use the chat function to share your thoughts and engage in discussion. Right now, I'm pleased to introduce the speakers in this session. For additional information about each speaker, you can access the speaker biography and headshots located in the LabRoots platform. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Thomas Trost Hansen, Head of Secretariat for the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy, Dr. Misha Teplitsky, Assistant Professor of Information at the University of Michigan, Dr. Melanie Brooks, Assistant Professor of Marketing at Columbia Business School, and Dr. Jonali Barua, Professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Tarleton State University. Now I'm going to turn things over to our first presenter, Dr. Thomas Trost Hansen. Thomas, please take the floor.
Thank you. And getting the slides running here. Yes, well, thank you for inviting me to speak on this session. I will be speaking about the work I did as a PhD student from 2016 to 2020. So that's already a handful of years ago. And I haven't really been involved in academic work since because I've entered the government service, and right now I'm holding the position as head of the Secretariat for the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy, and that's sort of the equivalent of the Danish Chief Science Advisor. But there is a link to scientific conferencing because I think there is a sort of an overlooked science policy tool here. I'll be speaking about how scientific events have academic impact and how to sort of theorize and think about, conceptualize how they have academic impact. And in order to do that, I start by giving an idea of how to think of academic impact. And in this regard, I rely on a model by Latour and Volgar called the cycle of credibility, where academic impact is understood as an exchange of different forms of credibility. So the example is that you receive a grant, you receive some money, and this money is converted into staff and equipment. This staff and equipment is converted into data. The data is converted into arguments. Arguments are turned into publications, and publications are then turned into recognition that once again is converted into money, and so the circle sort of goes. And I find this as a very sort of accurate and helpful description of what academic impact is, as I understand academic impact as sort of a productive conversion of forms of credibility. And taking this to scientific events, I believe you could think of scientific events as a marketplace for the conversion of credibility. And in this regard, the scientific event becomes this structure that facilitates conversions. And I'll come back and give a few examples of how this is playing out. But it's also important to say that at the scientific event, what you see is different forms of credibility than in sort of the normal working cycle of an academic. You have access to the form of credibility that I term the boss. you have access to network. And it's also clear that at academic events, you have a sort of more of a multi-directional conversion is available, meaning that you don't need to exchange money for staff and equipment that then is turned into data, that is turned into arguments and so on. You can actually be converting network to recognition directly at an event, or you can be turning data into network or into bus at a scientific event. So it's a more fluid market than the normal academic practice. And just some examples, and also a bit of a methodological thinking, a few hints on the methodological thinking behind this work. So I've done a number of interviews with researchers on the practice of going to conferences or academic events. And with these interviews, I was able to sort of draw out some of the conversions that I heard them speaking about. So one example is assistant professor who were able to turn bus picked up at a conference into a grant, basically. So we have this quote saying, "At the same time, I hear several presentations on machine learning. For me, it was a bit of a black hole, but I got a sense of the concept. I went home and thought about it, and I decided to write a quick application to the Independent Research Council, and it went through, probably because of the right buzzwords, like big data." So what you see here is really a conversion of one form of credibility to another. And similarly, you can find a lot of other examples in my interviews. And one example I have here is how you turn arguments into recognition. In these conferences, I try to increase my visibility. You have to cut out an argument in your presentation. You have to do something slightly different from what other people are doing, but it pays off. People notice you. And bringing this together, I would argue that one of the key findings is that the pricing at the marketplace, at the scientific event as a marketplace, is personalized. So scientific events are not perfect markets. You have considerable transaction costs and asymmetric information. And some of the differences or personalized pricing I found in my material was the difference between chairs and attendees. So you really see a difference in the conversions that chairs of events are able to do compared to the attendees. They have access to a lot better conversions, for example, in relation to networking and recognitions. We also see that chairs have access to other forms of conversions. That is examples of how chairs can convert administrative and logistics tasks and tasks on community building into recognition. And you also see it in sort of the scientific curation of a program, where picking out the keynotes it gives the chair an access to sort of access new buzz or decide what is the buzz of the conference, what is sort of the hot words going to be noticed. I also found major differences between established researchers and emerging researchers, where established researchers enjoy much better conversions compared to emerging researchers. It's a lot easier being an established researcher and at a scientific event compared to an emerging researcher. And I'm aware of quite an interesting research agenda on discrimination and what you could call, in my framework, personalized pricing in relations to gender, race, nationality, and age, and so forth. So I really think there's something going on there that you get a better price, basically, having some of these characteristics. And the other key finding is that there are important varieties between marketplaces. So in my work, I differentiate between 4 different types of events. I narrow out the symposium, which is really a specialized event focused on scientific advancements, digging deep into specific questions, almost having the form of a workshop. This is really about sort of getting a very specialized network and advancing a scientific agenda. Then you have the Congress, which is much broader in its scientific scope. It's about the broader forms of recognition. It's about widening network and so on. You have the specialty conference, which is a lot bigger than the symposium and a lot more specialized than the Congress. This is probably the form of conferences that we see most of. And then you have the practitioners meeting, where you really see a matching of practitioners, so people using the research in an everyday basis. In the medical field, this would be sort of clinical events or events that attract clinical researchers, but you have them in other fields as well. And there seems to be a correlation between the type of event and specific forms of conversion. So some events sort of facilitate some forms of conversions better than others. And very interestingly, from my perspective, you see a great similarity across main scientific fields. So even you have basically the same forms of conversions, from physics to the medical sciences, even to the humanities. And I found this quite interesting because there's a lot of talk of how the academic community is getting more and more specialized. But actually, when it comes to events, there's a really a convergence of our practices. We do it very similarly across the scientific fields. And if you would ask me to think about why is this conceptual framework interesting, I would say it's because it provides a framework for discussing the scientific impact of events, including how to evaluate and improve scientific events. So this is really, I think my framework offers a discussion of the core business of academics, and this is something that is really needed to develop an evaluative framework for these forms of impacts even further, because in the new brave world with an enhanced focus on climate and maybe also time and online events, it becomes very important that we are able to facilitate the best kinds of events, and the physical events that we actually have need to pay off. And I think this calls for a greater evaluation of the events. And it also offers this possibility of using events and using the chairing of events as a science policy tool. And what I mean with that is that it's a way of enhancing the network and the community building around a specific ecosystem. So chairing events brings attention to this specific ecosystem, and I think with my framework you could actually hint at some of the potential benefits of why it's worthwhile. I believe that was just about my 12 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Thomas, for getting us off to such a great start. And again, really interesting presentation. I think we'll have some follow-ups in the Q&A. Our next presenter is Dr. Misha Teplitsky, Assistant Professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Misha, the floor is now yours. I've now been informed that Dr. Teplitsky is having a little bit of internet connectivity issue. So our next presenter has, I'm trying to see from our organizers whether we should move ahead or not. Dr. Brooks, are you available to come on camera right now? Apologies for the swerve to you and also the audience. There she is. Hello.
Hello, I'm
I'll
happy.
give you oh, thank you. I'll give you a second to get situated there because you're going a little bit earlier than you had realized. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Melanie Brooks, Assistant Professor of Marketing at Columbia Business School, who is gratefully stepping in a different order than she was intending to, but I think we'll be fine later, and we'll welcome Dr. Teplitsky when he returns online. So Melanie, the floor is now yours.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here today, and thanks for the conference organizers for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here, and today I'm going to talk about some work that I've done looking at the psychological underlying process to virtual communication and how that can affect creativity. So I probably don't need a slide like this in a conference like this, but I think that it's important to acknowledge just how much our lives have fundamentally changed since COVID. Virtual interaction has really permeated all elements of our lives. So of course, we're seeing it now with virtual conferencing, but we're also seeing this in education. We're seeing virtual interaction in telehealth. We're seeing it in legal proceedings. We're seeing virtual interaction when we're socializing with others. There's really this massive shift towards interacting virtually and particularly over video. So because there's this huge shift, what we were really interested in is exploring how integrating virtual collaboration into our lives could affect a really fundamental, important process in science, and that is innovation. And we picked innovation because innovation relies on collaboration. We need to bring people together from different perspectives, each bring in their own puzzle piece to put together to innovate and come up with new ideas. And that's actually the reason we have conferences, or one of the main reasons, as we learned before, is about sharing and knowledge transfer in order to enable innovation. Now, traditionally, when we did these conferences or other ways where we got together to collaborate, this happened in person. Right. So symposium comes from the concept of Greek symposium, where people would get together in person and share ideas. We do this at conferences way up until basically COVID. We would come in person. Of course, we have classic examples of Lennon and McCartney or Watson and Crick. We were in person coming up with ideas. But now we're having this alternative route to collaborate together, where we're interacting over video. And so what this project was interested in was exploring how interacting over video instead of interacting in person could affect the innovation process. Now, innovation is a very broad concept, a very broad word. So I want to talk about specifically what I'm looking at when I say innovation. I'm very interested in early stage innovation. So the kinds of innovation that would come out of a conference where we're talking to someone else, we're generating some ideas, we might decide, what idea we want to explore next. And so there's two main steps in this early stage innovation that I kind of just prefaced here. So one is idea generation. So that's coming up with lots of ideas. It's kind of a brainstorming session where you have like a group of ideas that you create. And then once you've generated a bunch of ideas, you engage in idea selection, where you look through these ideas and determine which of these you would like to move forward with, which of these has the most potential. Now, research suggests that this idea generation process involves divergent thinking. So you really want to diverge out, be unfocused, unregulated, expansive, really exploring this full solution space of some sort. But once you've engaged in this divergent thinking, you've expanded out and you've had all these ideas, the idea selection process involves what we call convergent thinking. So it's focused, analytical, it's more narrow. So you're looking at your solution set in front of you, and you're kind of going through a systematic process of deciding, which of these ideas seem to have the most merit. Let's compare it on these different dimensions and identify the one with the most potential. So we were interested in how interacting on video compared to in person affects both the divergent process in idea generation and this more convergent process of idea selection. Now, when you look at past research that compared in person to different technologies, the main difference that this work argues between these two different types of interaction is in what and how information is transferred. So if you imagine talking on email, what is transferred is different. You're not hearing vocal tone, you're not seeing facial expressions. Also, how this information is transferred is different, right? You write a whole thing of text, you send it to someone, they give you text back. It's called asynchronous. So you're lacking more back channel feedback, for example, nods or things like that. But in a one-on-one type of video call, there really isn't that much difference anymore between communicating in person versus communicating over video, right? You can see the person's face. This is all happening in real time. You can see their facial expressions. You can see when I'm smiling. You can see me moving my hands. So if there's no difference in information transfer, or very little difference now, particularly one-on-one, does that mean there's no difference for innovation? But we thought there's still one crucial difference that hasn't been explored before, which is the scope of shared environment. So when we're interacting in person, we have the whole room as our shared environment. If I look over here, or if I look over here, I have not exited our shared space. But when we're interacting over video, as right now, the only thing that I have in common with you guys is this screen in front of me. And so I'm not going to look over here or look over there because that's not part of our shared environment, right? Our shared environment is very narrowed. And so we predicted, because the shared environment is just this screen, people would visually focus on this screen. This is always a bad pun, but we're basically zooming in on just this screen and kind of letting the rest of the world peel away. It's not relevant anymore. And this visual focus makes us more focused. We know that visual attention and attention are very closely connected. And so we predicted that you're more tethered to a screen, and therefore you are more focused on that screen, and that makes you more focused and less expansive in your thinking. So in other words, we predicted that virtual interactions should uniquely undermine this idea generation process, this expansive idea generation process, but not the idea selection process, which is this more focused analytical process. And this is because virtual interaction is narrowing your focus on the screen. So I ran one lab experiment and one field study that tested this. In the lab experiment, we had pairs generate uses for a product, so either a Frisbee or bubble wrap. And then they selected their most creative idea afterwards. And we had a very simple manipulation. People either met face-to-face in this kind of boring lab room, or they met with a 15-inch retina display of their partner's face in front of them instead. So really the only difference is, are you physically present in the same space, or are you in two separate spaces? But in both cases, your partner is right in front of you and you're seeing their face. And to measure creativity, we had judges score each idea on 2 dimensions. 1, how novel is it? And then 2, does it have value? And a creative idea or an innovative idea has both. It's novel, but it's also useful and implementable. So we averaged these 2 things to get a score for each idea. And then we looked at the number of total ideas and the number of creative ideas that were generated to get an idea of idea generation performance. And then for idea selection, we had 2 different measures. One was we took the actual score of their best idea of the set. So suppose their best idea was a 5 out of 7. And then we looked at the score of the idea they selected as their best. So suppose they selected an idea that was scored a 4. That means they had a decision error score of 1. And if they selected their best ideas, the decision error score would be 0. And then we just looked at the creativity of their selected idea. Okay, so I don't know how much time we have left. I realize I didn't start the timer, but I'll make sure I get through this quickly. But basically what we find is that simply being in the same physical space results in less or more creative ideas and more ideas in general than interacting virtually. So this does suggest that when we are interacting virtually, that is hampering this idea generation process, this expansive process. But we actually find that this is not the result when it comes to idea selection. In this case, if anything, people are a little bit better at idea selection when they're interacting over video. So we see the score, the selected idea, is somewhat higher when they're interacting over video. And the decision error score, which is basically how wrong they were, is higher when they're interacting in person. So this suggests that it's not just that Zoom is worse than in person, right? We hear this a lot, like, oh, Zoom is just not the same thing as interacting in person, because it's particularly hurting idea generation, but doesn't seem to have that same effect on idea selection. So this is, in the lab, if you remember, they're generating alternative uses for a Frisbee or for bubble wrap. We wanted to replicate this in a more realistic setting. And we had an amazing opportunity to run idea workshops with a telecommunications company where engineers who knew each other got together and they generated ideas, new business ideas for the company. And then they actual engineers evaluated those ideas, and they had the chance this could actually be an idea that becomes a product in the company, and they would get a big financial reward if that happened. And we randomly assigned them to either work face-to-face, and this is a photo from one of those studies, or they worked virtually and communicated over a technology they were very familiar with. And just in the interest of time, I'll say we replicated the exact same effect with these people. We found that they were generating fewer ideas and fewer creative ideas when they were interacting virtually compared to just being the same physical space. And then this replicated actually in all the different countries that we collected data in, which is kind of cool. It wasn't always significant depending on sample size, but the pattern was there for every single country we collected data in. And then we've again found that decision error score was higher in person than interacting virtually. Okay, so quick summary so far, we find that interacting in person leads to fewer ideas and fewer creative ideas interacting virtually. And this doesn't seem to happen for idea evaluation. Maybe it's even better virtually, but I don't know, certainly isn't worse. And we argue this is because the scope of the shared environment has changed, right? That we're now just zooming in on this screen and kind of ignoring the rest of the world, and that makes us more focused in our idea generation pursuit. So to test this, we randomly put props in a room and looked at people's memory of these props. And I'm realizing now that this slide's kind of messed up, but the next one is coming up. But some of these props were ones that you couldn't just assume knowing your schema of the lab. For example, you wouldn't assume that in a psych lab there would be a skeleton poster. And then this is off, but we had participants then fill out after they engaged in their task, either in person or virtually, where the props were in the room. Let's see if here's an example. Oops, let me push the audience. Here's an example of what this looked like where they drew it out. And what we predicted was that because when you're interacting virtually, you're kind of focused on the screen and ignoring the rest of your environment, you would remember less of your physical space than when you're interacting in person. And that's exactly what we see here. You can see this is cherry-picked examples, but we see people are remembering a lot more of their physical space when they're interacting in person compared to virtually. And here's the graph here. And this mediates the effect, meaning the fact that they recalled fewer items predicted their idea generation performance. We also measured this through eye gaze tracking. So we track people from their task computer. So if they're looking forward or down, that means looking at the task computer. If they're looking to their right, our left, that means they're looking at their partner, which is either a computer or a person. And everywhere else is looking at the surrounding room. And we found the effect that we are predicting here, which is that people are looking at their partner almost double when they're interacting on video, and they're looking at the surrounding room almost half. So they are really restricting their gaze to either the task computer or their partner and ignoring their broader environment. And again, this mediates. So what I mean by that is people who are interacting in person looked around the room more, and looking around the room positively predicted their idea generation performance. So overall, like this is, an initial step looking at the psychological process that we engage in when we're collaborating in person versus collaborating over video. And this initial finding shows that without doing anything different, we might hurt our idea generation process when we interact over video. But we have some talks later today, or I guess the last talk of the day, that we'll talk about maybe some ways in which we can address this problem. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Melanie, and you really set up, your colleagues on the panel for future discussion later on. So I think we will definitely have that interesting interchange, I think, between the four of you as well as with the audience a little bit later. I think Dr. Teplitsky is back on, so we're going to go back to him, if that's okay. So our next presenter is Dr. Misha Teplitsky, Assistant Professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Misha, the floor is now yours.
Awesome. So is audio okay? Video okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everybody. Glad to share this research with you. Hopefully my internet's been a little spotty, but hopefully it doesn't decide to disappear. So this work is with Soya, Neil, and David, all at MIT. I'm at University of Michigan. And the idea with this research is we're going to propose of one way to think about in-person conferences. What do they really do? And to set the scene a little bit, I'm going to set some scope conditions. So we're not going to be comparing virtual and in-person conferences. We're going to be focusing on in-person conferences only, but comparing them to other ways of getting the same information, namely by reading papers. And so the question we're going to pose is, so what's the point of meeting in person? It's expensive, it's polluting, it takes time, when we could read the same info online. Right, that's kind of the puzzle we're going to try to understand. And this is not a new puzzle. People have been studying some version of this question for probably 100 years or more. Kind of applying this literature to the conference in context, I think we can distill some advantages of in-person communication. So relative to just having access to the papers online, in-person communication might, first of all, give us access to different kinds of information. So there might be like some information might only be available in person. So for example, maybe it's preliminary findings or sensitive findings. People may not want to put those online. In-person kind of communication might help us find that information better than kind of Googling, trying to make our way through the voluminous kind of scientific literature. In-person communication might confer some advantages in absorbing the information, and that also gives us an option to kind of give feedback and maybe make the information, or in our case, papers, better. Right? So there's this two-way aspect to it. So that I think we kind of already know from the literature more or less. And the question we're going to ask is, well, what about the case where the information is available online? You are already aware of it. You don't need to go kind of discover it somehow. It's actually really relatively easy to absorb. You don't need necessarily the in-person person speaking, and there's no real opportunity for feedback. So I think our kind of knowledge, would tell us that for these kinds of cases, online kind of access to the same information should be more or less sufficient. And what we're gonna argue, what we do argue in this paper, is what we really should be paying attention to, if I may kind of say so, is attention itself. And I like to think of it as through this, what I call my wall of shame, which you can sort of maybe even see here in the back. So, these are all the papers I want to read. There's so many cool papers. I print them out so that I can avoid going to conferences, right? And lo and behold, these papers have been hanging on the wall for years now, right? So they're not getting read, despite my kind of knowing about them and being able to absorb them. And yet here we are. They're not getting read. Hence the shame. But what is the kind of the upshot here? Well, that I'm going to argue is a more general kind of problem that with the problem of actually committing our attention to the thing we want to learn when it's not in person. So we're going to think of conference as a commitment device, meaning it's something that you do now that limits your kind of range of actions in the future. And from this perspective, in-person conferences have two kind of committing features. So first, you kind of commit in advance to, like, you pay the fee, maybe schedule the flights, hotel. So there's a commitment made up front to go there. So that sort of limits your options when the day comes. You're going. And also at the conference, usually they're organized in sessions. So at least in person, there's a lot of kind of friction, or let's say pragmatic sort of factors keeping you in the session from beginning to end. Like, it's kind of undiplomatic to walk in and out in the middle, right? Or you might be even stuck in some kind of row. So chances are you're kind of stuck for the whole thing. Okay, so that's sort of the argument we're going to make, and that's where we'll argue conferences. One of the features in-person conferences have, and that's why they help us learn. How are we going to make that argument empirically? So we're going to use data from a scheduling app called Confer. So this is an app. When you go to a conference, there's a bunch of these. You kind of browse papers, you click the ones you like, and you get a personalized schedule. So Confer is one such app. We're going to use data from that. It's been deployed at, especially in computer science. So we're going to look at data from 25 computer science conferences held in person between 2013 and 2019. And the data is of this kind of user paper pair nature. So we have data from about 2,500 users of this app. They're generally computer scientists and industry kind of people, tech industry people. And we have data on about 90,000 kind of likes that they made on this app. We're going to use those likes. We're going to look up which sessions those were in. And we're going to also see what else in that session, what else was scheduled for that session that they didn't heart or didn't like. Right, so we have about 90,000 likes, and then 8,000 of these non-liked papers that are in the same session that a person might encounter if they're forced to sit in the session. Okay, and the next piece is scheduling conflicts, and that's kind of maybe the cool part, or I'd like to think the cool part about this project. So we're gonna make the argument that scheduling conflicts kind of semi-randomly affect whether you're actually able to see the paper presented. And we have a bunch of sort of analyses for why this assumption is a good one, that this is happening sort of quasi-randomly. And so the idea is that if you like two papers, or if you like one paper in a particular time slot, there's no conflict. So you have kind of full opportunity to see that paper presented. If there are two papers you like and they happen to be scheduled at the same time, there's less opportunity to see them, right? You can only go to at most one of them. And where there's like infinitely many papers scheduled, hypothetically, then you have no opportunity to see them at all. And we're gonna, and we argue that this happens relatively at random. What that enables us to do is to set up a following model where we can look at what people liked, how many scheduling conflicts they had, so whether they were actually able to see the paper presented, and whether they cited it in the future. So we're going to measure effects of conflicts on citations with the following model, which I'll can talk about more if needed. Okay, so here's what we find. So first, let's look at the case when people have infinitely many conflicts or very many conflicts. In those cases, they couldn't see the paper presented, and so they could still cite it, but through these other channels, namely because they read it online. And what we see is that, X number of years after the presentation, which is here on the X-axis, on the Y-axis is the probability that they cited the paper. So without ever seeing the paper presented, we know that, people cite it, of course, and that probability goes up over time. However, if they were able to see the paper presented, the chances that they cite it are around 63% more. Okay, so this is our first evidence that seeing things presented in person makes you cite it more, even though you could have easily read it online and you even knew about it because you liked it, right? Furthermore, we do the same analysis for papers in the session that you didn't like, but probably encountered because you were stuck sitting there. So we call these kind of serendipity papers. So yes, you also are more likely to, you can also cite those even if you couldn't see them, although the baseline kind of citation rate is a lot lower, right? These are not really papers of interest to you. However, if you happen to be able to be in that session in person, the chances that you cite these serendipity papers went up a lot, in particular by about 125%. Furthermore, what kinds of papers are these that are getting cited because of these in-person presentations? So we might, and maybe I'll just actually hide this for a sec. We might hypothesize that, stuff that you already know about that's related to your area, you're going to encounter anyway. It's easy enough for you to read because it's in your space. You don't really need in-person presentations for that. And so we measure how far kind of the intellectually papers are from each other, the things, your own work and the things you cite. We do that with embeddings. Can talk about that more if needed. But what we find is that the papers that people cite because of in-person presentations, that effect is really concentrated among papers that are very similar to your prior work. Right, so this is important because it means that in-person presentations aren't helping you absorb distant work that would be hard for you to read on your own. On the contrary, it's exactly stuff that would be easy for you to read on your own. That's the stuff you're absorbing with in-person presentations. Okay, so to summarize, where does that leave us? So first, the literature will tell us that, there's something special about in-person presentations that makes us go there, and they should have some communication advantages, right? So maybe the things presented there are different from the things you could find elsewhere. Maybe it helps you find that easy to absorb. We take a setting where none of those things are the case, and we find that it's actually, especially for those things that you could have easily read online, that's the part where conferences or in-person presentations are doing the most work. And kind of by exclusion, sort of by thinking through the mechanisms and excluding, kind of ruling out certain ones, we're more or less left with the one of committing attention. It's about actually kind of the discipline and the concentration of getting our attention to that paper. That's what in-person conferences seem to enable us to do. They also, because they curate papers by topic, help us discover related work that we would not have discovered had we not been stuck in that session. However, and they don't appear to help us discover things that are far away from us, right? Which we maybe would have thought. That doesn't seem to be the case. And kind of big picture is that we're contributing to this distinction, which research in the space always ends up kind of finding, that there's a big difference between the affordances of technology, sort of what they, in theory, enable us to do versus what people actually do. So here, online access to information enables us, in theory, to read these papers quickly, cheaply, without polluting. But because it's hard to actually commit our attention to them and concentrate, that doesn't happen unless we're do it in person. And so I think for this conference, one kind of question that arises from this work even though that wasn't the exact question kind of our data enables us to answer, is where do virtual conferences sit? If our kind of hypothesis is correct that conferences are a commitment mechanism, then a good question to ask of virtual conferences is, are they an equally good or kind of at least similarly good commitment mechanism? Do they also force us to sit through things we maybe wouldn't have sat through otherwise? And with that, I'll finish. So, this, if you're interested for the gory details, here's a preprint. And, wait, any questions? Thanks.
Thank you, Misha, and yes, your internet was stable all throughout, so it was really good to have you present all the way through. And again, even if the order switched from the original, I think you added a lot to the two previous presentations, and certainly set up the one that we're about to hear. Actually, our final presenter is on screen now, and she is Dr. Jonali Barua, professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Tarleton State University. Jonali, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. I am an experimental psychologist, and my research focus is in the area of creativity and innovation in virtual as well as face-to-face teams. So today I'm going to talk about facilitating virtual teams. As we all know, we already had sessions in the morning where we discussed different aspects of virtual meeting and how common they are in organizational setup. So our research currently in our lab, we are focusing on facilitating virtual teams. Before talking about the facilitation part, I would like to present two of our, we have conducted a series of experiments to compare the effectiveness of different types of virtual meetings. But we are going to present I am first going to talk about my virtual presentation. And I'm sure you all are very familiar with virtual group meeting. And there have been some latest studies that are examining how the modality works, how virtual group meeting works, and what are the psychological effects. And then also there are some research on physiological effects, such as fatigue and anxiety. And then there are issues such as, equity issues, gender difference in speaking time. These are some of the latest findings in the area of virtual group meetings. However, our focus in our lab is to look at the modality. There are different types of virtual meeting. So we first wanted to look at how do they perform in different modalities? And then based on our finding, we wanted to look at ways to facilitate this kind of meetings. Especially, we came up with a prototype. My collaborator, Dr. Kalita, and we developed a machine learning based prototype to provide live feedback to virtual groups so that we can enhance their performance. So first, I'm going to talk about the comparisons that we made in our experimental studies. So there could be different types of virtual meetings. So in our first experiment, we wanted to compare virtual meeting that is video-based meeting with chat-based interaction. When I say chat-based interaction, there are different types of chat portals. So we specifically wanted to look at the difference between video-based meeting and brain writing, virtual brain writing. So brain writing is a new concept. We have not come across any studies that had actually looked at virtual brain writing, although there are there are studies in the literature that looked at face-to-face brainwriting, and research already found that brainwriting, face-to-face brainwriting was better than face-to-face meetings, in-person meetings, because people are not distracted by observable diversity in group members, and they don't have to wait for their turns. They can just generate their ideas, write their ideas in these little sticky notes, and present them on a common virtual space where everybody can focus on the ideas. Now, what happens in video-based meeting is pretty much similar to face-to-face meetings. Of course, there are differences, as my previous presenter, Dr. Brax, talked about the difference between face-to-face meeting and video-based meeting. Face-to-face meeting did not performed better than video-based meeting. So our focus is, does video-based meeting perform better than this kind of text-based meeting where they don't get to see each other? Well, I'm not going to go into the methodological aspect, so I just want to present the findings. So what we found was that virtual brainwriting groups, they generated more original ideas than video-based brainstorming groups. And in terms of feasibility, the video-based groups, they generated more feasible ideas than brainwriting groups. Now, when we talk about feasibility, I wanted to bring this to the attention of everyone. There is something called feasibility bias, which is very common in face-to-face groups. Literature has already, there are a lot of studies in the literature where, studies have found that when we are in face-to-face groups, we tend to focus on, the topics that are, preferred by everyone. We spend time talking about things that we like to talk about. And when it comes to decision-making or idea selection, we don't generate original ideas. We tend to always generate the most common and unoriginal ideas, and we look at feasibility, where we don't look at how original it is. So we found the same trend in face-to-face, which is video-based meeting. However, brainwriting groups, they were less feasible in their ideas, but they're more original. Again, research has shown there is a negative correlation between feasibility and originality. So it's understood why, brainwriting group was less feasible. And in terms of total number of ideas, you can see that brainwriting groups generated more ideas than video-based brainstorming groups. So, now, in the second experiment, we wanted to look at what happens when we compare the video-based groups with text-based collaboration, where people just chat. Text-based collaboration such as chat room is very common, in organizations, especially in, multinational companies where, team members are geographically dispersed. So this kind of collaboration is very common. We wanted to see whether they are more creative than the video-based meetings. So we looked at 3 phases of innovation. That is idea generation phase. First one is idea generation phase. And then after generating the ideas, the groups had to select the top 5 ideas. That is the selection phase. And the third one is to refine their selected ideas, to evaluate those ideas, to make them better. And we wanted to compare which group does better. And our hypothesis was that text-based groups will generate more original ideas, and they will demonstrate more elaboration of ideas compared to the video-based groups. And this is what we found. As you can see across 3 sessions, in the brainstorming session, you will see that video-based group, they generated more ideas, more good quality ideas, but then again, it is not significant. The difference was not significant. Then the text-based group in the brainstorming session, However, as I mentioned, there's no significant difference though. But if you look at the evaluation phase, the text-based group, they refined those ideas, then they came up with more, they came up with better quality ideas than the video-based groups. So we also used our post-experimental questionnaires, and we found that because they don't get to see each other, they're not distracted by people's looks. They just can focus on the ideas, and they were free to express their evaluation. So they didn't have evaluation apprehension, and that was one of the reasons why the text-based groups did better than video-based groups. So then our next focus was we also looked at attention, and we also found that attention mediated the relationship between the quality of ideas in the generation session and the quality of ideas in the refinement session. And some of the recent studies have already found that attention is a big issue in video-based meeting if you don't facilitate the groups well, because there is a lot of multitasking that happens in video-based groups. People mute themselves, they mute their cameras, and they continue texting. They'll do other things while they will be attending the meeting, and that has a significant impact on their creativity. So our next focus was to so in sum, what we found was that video-based meetings, their ideas were less original, they were less elaborate, and there was less attention. There was uneven speaking time among the members in the groups, and attention was a big issue there. So our next focus was to look at ways to facilitate the video-based meetings, because video-based meeting is a common platform nowadays, and it especially for remote teams, they don't have they can use text-based interactions, but sometimes face-to-face interactions are important. So our focus was to look at how to facilitate this kind of video-based meeting. So we wanted to develop a smart meeting assistant. Basically, it is a prototype which is developed based on using some machine learning based trainings. So basically, we wanted to address the following issues. So that smart meeting assistant will provide the proceedings of the meetings. It will make sure that there is equity in participation. Typically, what happens in face-to-face groups or video-based meetings, there is unequal participation. Some people will talk for a longer period of time than others. So we wanted to make sure that, how to maintain that equity in participation. And then we wanted to measure productivity and creativity of participants who participated in video-based groups. So we all know, I think most of us are familiar with Zoom or Teams. So what happens is we use Zoom in our study, and Zoom has an option called closed captioning. So everything you say, it just, you can read it, what we are saying. So you can see the closed captioning. But the interesting part is that closed captioning gets, it goes somewhere and you can see the whole discussion like this. There somewhere it gets saved. So my collaborator, Dr. Kalita, who's a computer science, who's a professor of computer science in University of Colorado Springs, what they did is they used this transcript, which is created by closed captioning, and they wanted to study basically train the machine to study creativity in groups. So what we did was, in our study, we had groups generate ideas. So they engaged in a brainstorming session. The problem was how to please create a new sport. And then there were 50 groups, and this is how their transcript looked like. And then what they did was, I wanted to show something here, but I'm not sure how the video will work. But anyway, let me check. Okay. There was a video here. I'm not sure why the video is not working. It just shows how each person, it shows a dynamic bar graph like this. And every time, as you can see, these are participants, NA0, NA40, NA41, and NA42. These are 3 participants. As they are generating ideas, the dynamic graph will show how many ideas they have generated, what is the total time taken by each participant. And this particular feedback is given by our prototype, which is live, and it also gives this feedback of how many turns each person has taken in this task. So again, this can be visible to all the members, or it can be visible only to the host. So we created a prototype, something like this, so this is the summary. This is how it gives us the summary of all the findings. At the end of the meeting, it tells us, how much time each person has taken, what is the percentage of, ideas generated, and total time, total duration. And then we wanted to look at divergent and convergent tendencies in these kind of sessions. Divergent tendencies means how many topics the groups have explored so far, and convergent tendency is to what extent the groups are just focusing on one topic and not exploring other perspectives, because this is very common in groups. When we are not facilitated well, we tend to focus on one area because everybody enjoys talking and they forget to focus on different areas. So we wanted to come up with this prototype to provide a live feedback to the group in terms of how many topics they have, on that broad problem, how many topics they have investigated so far, or whether they have been spending on a certain topic for, say, past 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So these are the kind of feedbacks we want to offer. And then I also wanted to let you know how this machine learning worked. So machine learning basically used something called topic modeling. And topic modeling is a method that is used by machine learning where each sentence is converted into a vector, and it looks at the semantic similarity of the sentences or the topics that are discussed. And based on that semantic similarity, the machine learning creates different categories or topics, and that's how it presents. It counts what are the different types, the different topics that the group has investigated. And also, in this experiment, we wanted to compare the effectiveness of our machine learning with ChatGPT, because we all know that ChatGPT is something which is very common these days. People are talking about, why do all these studies, just use ChatGPT and they'll do it all. And so we wanted to compare manual coding of total ideas and, exploration of different topics and originality with machine learning. And also we used ChatGPT. So we wanted to compare these 3 in terms of the effectiveness of our prototype. So these are some of the predefined categories, and we asked the humans to categorize ideas based on these topics. Similarly, the prototype had to do the same thing using the same categories, and we gave the same instruction to ChatGPT. So basically, we gave the whole set of transcripts to them, and this is how they developed the ideas. And I'm going to the next. So this is the result. We see that there is a lot of similarity between machine learning and human learning, but there is a significant difference because ChatGPT has explored fewer number of categories. However, the machine learning is comparable to human coding. And we also looked at we did a simple t-test, and we found that there is no significant difference between machine learning and human coding. And we did not compare ChatGPT because ChatGPT generated, the results given by ChatGPT is more concise, and it could not be compared with machine coding and human learning. So basically, In general, what we have achieved so far, we have developed this smart meeting assistant that looked at the total number of ideas generated, speaking time, number of turn taking, total number of topics explored, and total number of ideas within each topic. So future directions, we want to develop this tool that will help us provide live feedback. And then also we wanted to look at something which is most important. This machine learning prototype will predict Zoom fatigue by looking at people's, tone, their physical expressions, such as, yawning and all other, their other aspects. And this is one area that we are working on currently. And that's all from my end. And thank you for having me in the presentation.
Oh, thank you, Jonali. I know that you had more to present, and maybe you might cover that if you're answering some questions here in just a little bit. But yeah, really 4 wonderful presentations, each different, but certainly interconnected. And in our prep for this session, we discovered how much the 4 speakers had been familiar with each other's work, and so really, I think you'll hear that sort of integration as we're getting into the questions. So I'm actually happy to say that we have some questions specifically for each speaker that came in through the Q&A, and so I'd like to start with those as your moderator here today. And I know it feels like a long time ago that Thomas gave his presentation, but if I could ask all of the speakers to come on camera, that would be great. This will be our panel on stage, so to speak. So Thomas, you've got a question about your framework, and the question is, when you bring your framework to the attention of senior or privileged scientists, do they embrace it? For instance, is the problem lack of knowledge or lack of willingness to share power?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think what I've experienced is that my framework opens for a more nuanced discussion on what it means being and going to conferences, and sort of what is the strategy and the aim of attending or chairing an event. And in that sense, I have a feeling that more senior or privileged researchers are able to see what it is that they get out of it, and also what they have sort of historically gotten out of it. And going through that sort of discussion or mental work, they'll notice maybe I could be helping my emerging researcher have some of the same benefits. Maybe I could encourage and help engage in some of these conversions, because I think there's a huge potential for senior researchers helping emerging researchers engage in these conversions and sort of push them and help get these more beneficial conversions.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. The next question is for Melanie in the order of your presentations. Melanie, are there any virtual platforms that can encourage creativity, such as virtual event platforms that use avatars and allow participants to connect in a virtual space?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's really interesting. And I don't know of much work that's explored this, but there's 2 different things to consider with that question that I think are interesting future pursuits. So one is, as technology improves, our ability to create a sense of shared environment increases. And we can think about, the metaverse in the future and how that could allow people to share the same virtual space in the same way that right now we share physical space. And I'm really interested in seeing if that can turn off some of the negative effects that I've observed. The issue is right now, the metaverse that has been created is so different from physical reality. Like Facebook's metaverse, like you're missing your legs and like you're so lacking in any kind of facial expressions or things like that. It's so removed from the humanity of people that I think it adds all this extra noise that it's hard to know if we got in effect what's causing it, which leads to your second question, or second part of your question, which is avatars or different things like that. And I do think we know that play helps with creativity. And we know that, putting on like perspective taking and putting on different hats, it helps with creativity. And so I think it would be interesting to use, different backgrounds, or use different avatars, or use the ability to kind of play with reality when we're on in virtual spaces, to allow for that play, or to allow for more perspective taking. I don't know of much work that's empirically tested it, but I think it's a really interesting one. I know some people doing some work about that in the telemedicine space too, that having avatars could give you a little bit more distance. And so you might be more willing to admit embarrassing things during like a medical call or something like that, if you are in an avatar form rather than in person. In the same way, creativity can sometimes feel risky to have an idea that sounds completely off the wall, and maybe an avatar would make people feel more comfortable having those kind of wild ideas. So it's a really interesting question, but I don't know of any work that has tested it yet.
Thank you for that answer. Next up, there's a question for Misha. Misha, did you find people who attended in-person presentations of the papers see the paper's findings more credible, reflecting on Hansen's talk in parentheses?
So short answer is no, or like we don't have that data, is the short answer. The slightly longer answer is I'm skeptical, because the the argument we try to make is that there's nothing special that happens at these presentations aside from you just actually encountering the content of the paper. It's not that something there is said, and this is speculation on my end, right? Like we don't have clear measures of this, but the fact that it's papers you knew about, that you liked already, you could have easily read, suggests that there's not some huge increase in credibility or some additional context that's being communicated. It's just that you find, instead of the paper laying there and not getting your attention, now it does. That's kind of how we're interpreting our data.
Yeah, I think Thomas has a follow-up question.
Yeah, or a comment, because I think there is something going on in this presentation talk. I generally think that more information is transmitted during a presentation compared to reading a paper, in the sense that you get a bit of the wider context. You build a sense of credibility around the presenter. You get this sort of human sense of whether this seems credible. You get sort of the toning of the arguments. All of this, I believe, is influencing whether you actually find the paper credible. I think there's something going on there.
Yeah, Melanie?
Yeah, I want to add to that too, that the context in which you're exposed to the information is so much more rich that could help with memory as well. So not just like, did you pay attention, but like how many other cues are in the environment that connect to the thing you paid attention to, that could affect how well you recall it, including like the person's face and how they were presenting it.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, Misha, do you have any comments in reply?
Yeah, well, I think these are good points. I think all of us are kind of speculating to some extent. Me first and foremost, right? Like, because it's the papers in our data, at least, because it's the papers that you already knew about and are closest to you. To me, it suggests the influence of these additional richness of the communication is much less important. But that's pure speculation. I think getting good measures on this would be really useful, because maybe I'm wrong. Right?
Thank you for those comments and answers to and the follow-ups, I should say. Jonali, you got a question asking what are some future directions for integrating AI into scientific idea generation in the virtual space?
Thank you. That's a great question. Actually, we are looking at different aspects currently, but the research is in a very nascent stage at the moment. The focus is on how to enhance a participation in groups, but in future we definitely would like to look at other aspects. For example, the mental health aspects, the health aspects of people. As we are becoming more and more virtual, we are glued to the screen, and what are the physiological advantages and disadvantages, and how do we facilitate groups in those along those lines. So Zoom fatigue is a big topic nowadays. How focusing on the screen and focusing on small tiles on a screen can actually make you feel sick. And also there are some other questions of equity. Some of the recent studies have found that females get lesser talking time than males. People of color, they feel more overlooked than others. These are some of the very latest findings. So maybe if we develop some sort of prototype or some smart assistant that can predict the performance of the meeting by studying the initial trend, and this is possible. Some of the very latest articles actually talked about that. We can predict the future performance of this group if we study the interaction of these group members in a video-based meeting for the first 15 minutes. So that prediction will be very helpful, because that will help the managers to figure out how effective this group is going to be, or how to facilitate these groups to make them more creative. Should we facilitate them in terms of making everyone talk, or should we ask them to go take a walk because some people are yawning and they're kind of bored, or should we give a break now? There are so many things that we can do in video-based groups to facilitate them, and it is hard to do that in face-to-face groups. Over the years in our creativity research, we have tried to facilitate the face-to-face groups. The problem is the facilitator will have to provide the feedback there and then in front of everyone. But when it comes to video-based meetings, this facilitation is easier. The host can get that feedback and others won't. And if we want to give a specific feedback to someone saying, hey, you're not participating, can you just, kind of unmute your video and say something? So these are some of the things that we can do without causing any embarrassment. So it is more effective. So I think in future, we can come up with different types of, different ways to facilitate video-based meetings, because video meetings is not, this paradigm is not going to go away. It is going to be more and more popular as we are becoming more and more geographically dispersed. So we need to come up with more ways to facilitate these video-based meetings, and it is possible. And it can be more effective than any kind of virtual meetings, or of course the face-to-face meetings.
Thank you for that. So you all have the benefit and the role of being the one of the last sessions of the conference as it ends, and there's been a lot of rich discussion in all the other sessions and recommendations and things that have hit on some of the points. So kind of a big picture question, and I'd like each of you to take if you can 1 minute to answer this approximately. Sort of a takeaway of how can organizations that plan and host scientific conferences and meetings really create opportunities for researchers to come together, engage in creative idea generation, develop research questions or ideas for grant proposals, or even find collaborators, right? In this way, and just interested in your thoughts as to how planners can create these kinds of opportunities for people to come together and find collaborators and generate ideas. So I'll go back to Thomas, maybe first.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think I have two answers to it, or two ideas for approaching it. One part of it is that I think we need to start evaluating events at a completely different level. We need to sort of have a practice of looking into the event as an important venue and evaluating different aspects and understanding what actually works. And that's sort of the boring answer. And then there's a bit more forward-looking answer, which relates to a sense that many researchers attend events without having a very clear idea of what the purpose of their presence is. And I think as an organizer, if you are very clear on the purpose and the aim of a specific session, you would probably be able to generate more impact, a better outcome for the participants. So being more specific on what is it that we actually want to have going here would be a way of enhancing it.
Okay, great. No, thank you for getting us started with that. I know it's a broad question. Maybe I'll turn to Melanie next.
Yeah, I think this is a question I thought a lot about in the context of getting people back to work. And we saw, like, initially after COVID, companies were saying it was fun, like everyone can work remotely. And now since then, a lot of CEOs, for example, like with Disney, have been asking people to come back in person. And my answer is, like, first and foremost, you need to make this a place that people want to be. I don't think it makes sense to, like, force people to go back in the office or still require there to be in-person conferences without making it incentivized, because people should want to be there. And also, when people are happy and enjoying where they're at, they're going to be more creative regardless. So I think thinking about, like, what would make people want to be in person, I still think being in person is important when possible. Is also useful to do virtual conferences, particularly for the concerns of diversity that was brought up in the questions as well. But I think that there's still a place for in-person conferences, and we need to make it a place that people want to go to. And same with virtual conferences too, as Misha's point, that it's a commitment device to go to an in-person conference. But if we make virtual conferences attractive enough that people will actually commit and go to that as well, then we'll have them providing the attention that they are providing in the in-person ones. So it sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes I think it's overlooked that we just need to make these places people want to go to, find ways to make them fun, find ways. We don't have to, isn't have to be all just science. I think things that bring people together is really important.
Thank you. And Misha, I think she queued you up a little bit there, so I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I agree with what's been said. Like, for example, kind of the lack of great research on this. It's such an important area, but the number of studies out there is pretty limited. Like, for example, when I was, like in my project, we're studying in-person conferences more or less, and that seems like, you would think, a very old topic that people have been doing those kinds of meetings for decades and decades, and we should have some good data on their effects. But even that we know very little about in terms of effects, right? And now we're adding virtual, and we're trying to compare. And realistically, like, we need way more research and, like, access to data. And I think one takeaway for organizations is they should be, like, studying this themselves, like randomizing where they can, because we frankly just don't know. We don't have great quantification of sort of costs and benefits and stuff like that. And I think and I kind of want to plus one on this point too, that it's the kind of motivation, or kind of making it something attractive enough, versus what, maybe you would go somewhere to Hawaii and also learn some papers. Like, that's a tough that's a tough thing to recreate online. But if we want people to commit their attention, that it maybe needs to be equally attractive, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Janali, same question. You get the last answer on this question anyway.
Well, yeah, most of you already have discussed some of the very interesting topics. What I want to add is that, video-based meetings could focus more on highlighting on tools that can enhance inclusiveness in the group in video-based meetings, leverage diversity in the group, how to leverage, people coming from different background, different ethnicity, gender, how to leverage their diverse experience in making the group better. And of course, develop new tools that will facilitate the people with disabilities to make this platform easier for them. And I think it is doable, over a period of time. Is just, we need to look at those aspects to make these kinds of meetings more effective in future.
Thank you. You led into, I think, what I think is going to be the last question to answer, and so hopefully this can combo with any key sort of takeaway messages as well. So we got a question. So groups with high diversity can produce better or more innovative science. There's literature out there on that. Virtual meetings provide greater accessibility, as Janali just mentioned, for underrepresented groups. Can some of the downsides of creativity in the virtual environment be countered by allowing more diverse groups to convene together? And, as you answer that, again, if you have any other closing thoughts, key takeaways you'd like to place, please add those as well. So again, maybe I'll start with Janali this time. I know she's been going last. I'll have her go first and maybe go in reverse order. Please take, if you would, just take 1 minute.
Yes. So one of the common downsides of diverse group is when we are exposed to observable diversities, we get distracted. Sometimes we like someone's face and we get more attracted to that face compared to someone other. But in a virtual environment, we have this advantage that we can keep ourselves muted if we want, if we don't want others to look at us, but still get all our knowledge. We can share, we can talk by muting ourselves. And that's fine. Still, we are sharing our knowledge with them. And yes, there are some studies that look at, facial expression is important. But again, studies are mixed, because sometimes when you really focus too much on that little screen, looking at someone's facial expression, you suffer from mirror anxiety. You look at you see your face, and then you feel like, oh, my face doesn't look good. So there are advantages, I would say, like you mute your camera and you generate ideas, you share your ideas, and that way you can be free to express whatever you want to express, and don't feel that apprehension that people are observing you. So this is one that comes to top of my head. But yeah, there are so many other aspects as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, no, it's hard to answer this quickly, but just in 1 minute, please, Thomas, if you, I can call on you next.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's definitely something going on there. A very important topic. One important aspect is to keep the diversity alive at the physical events. So really think about how you could have grants that improve the diversity at the physical events. This is an important tool for widening participation. This is really a topic to think about for funding agencies and others with power over the research system. We really need to bring people physically together.
Okay, thank you. Melanie, can I call on you next? Misha will get the anchor leg.
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I also think that turning off the video could help with the focus issues that I've found before, where people narrow in on the screen. But yeah, I also agree with the point that we need to still enable diversity in physical settings as well. I don't want the presence of virtual conferences to negate the importance of diversity in the physical conferences or in-person conferences.
Okay, now thank you for that. And Misha, again, last word.
One thing that comes to mind that I hadn't really thought of before is like one advantage I think of the virtual environment is how easy it is to kind of randomly put people into various groups. One thing we know from, I think, in general, when you give people the option of choosing, they're often going to prefer talking or collaborating someone who's like similar to them. One, I think, under maybe appreciated benefit of online that maybe organizers should do more with is just how easy it is to constrain people's choices and kind of nudge them towards more diversity.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and really thank you to all four presenters for some great food for thought presentations, data and evidence, which I think is growing and is continuously, I think, fascinating for this audience as well as our planning committee. So again, want to thank you for your time and engagement for sure. Also want to say that this ends this session. We do have a final session, a summary and closing for day 2 that is happening right now at 4:30 back in the main auditorium. You can find the link there. So again, I just really want to, from our planning committee, express our appreciation to the presenters today, congratulate them on their work, and again, we look forward to your scholarship moving forward. This concludes the session, and again, please come to the summary and closing session for the conference in day 2 at 4:30. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Gene.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.